The rain poured relentlessly as the abandoned German shepherd whimpered, tied to a tree, his eyes searching the empty road, alone, betrayed. But then a stranger appeared, and everything changed. The wind howled through the empty lot, rattling the brittle branches of the lone tree where the German shepherd was tied. His fur, once thick and proud, was matted with mud and rain, his body trembling from exhaustion. Each breath was labored, his ribs faintly visible beneath the coarse coat that had once been a source of warmth and pride. But worst of all was his eyes, deep pools of amber, reflecting pain, confusion, and an undying hope that someone would come back for him. For hours he had waited. The scent of his owner, once a source of comfort, had faded into the cold night air. The collar around his neck was tight, digging into his flesh each time he moved, the rope binding him to the tree frayed from his desperate attempts to free himself. But his strength was waning. Hunger gnawed at his belly. Thirst burned his throat. And yet, despite it all, he remained vigilant. He had been trained to wait, to be loyal, to believe in his master's return. But the man who had once called him good boy was gone. Beyond the empty lot, the city hummed with life. Cars sped down slick roads, their headlights cutting through sheets of rain. People hurried past, hunched under umbrellas, oblivious to the silent tragedy unfolding just beyond the pavement. No one noticed the abandoned dog. No one stopped. Until he did. Daniel Carter wasn't supposed to be here. He had taken a wrong turn on his way home, distracted by thoughts he couldn't seem to shake. It had been a long week at the clinic, and his mind was heavy with the weight of lives he had saved and the ones he had lost. Being a veterinarian meant carrying a burden that never quite lifted. But fate had a way of leading people exactly where they needed to be. As his truck rolled past the empty lot, something in the corner of his vision made him slow down. A shadow beneath the tree. Movement. He squinted through the downpour and saw the unmistakable shape of a dog, large, trembling, tethered to the trunk like a forgotten piece of trash. His chest tightened. He had seen cases like this before. Owners who no longer had the patience, the money, the heart. Some abandoned their pets in shelters, giving them a slim chance. Others left them in places like this, where the odds of survival were far worse. Daniel cursed under his breath and pulled over. The moment he stepped out of the truck, the rain drenched him to the bone, but he didn't care. He approached slowly, hands raised in a gesture of peace. The dog stiffened. "It's okay, buddy," Daniel murmured, his voice steady despite the anger brewing in his chest. "I'm not going to hurt you." The German shepherd didn't growl. He didn't lunge. He only watched, eyes flickering between fear and hope, his ears twitching at the sound of Daniel's voice. Daniel took another step forward, assessing him with a practiced eye. He was malnourished, but not beyond saving. The rope around his neck was cruelly tight, restricting movement. But the biggest sign of his suffering wasn't his physical condition. It was his posture, the way he lowered his head slightly, as if bracing for a blow. Daniel's jaw clenched. Whoever had done this had not only abandoned him, but had likely hurt him too. "Let's get you out of here," he said softly, reaching for the rope. The dog flinched, but he didn't bite. He had every reason to. He had been betrayed, left to suffer in the cold. But something deep within him told him to trust this stranger. As soon as the rope loosened, the dog collapsed against Daniel, his legs giving out beneath him. He was too weak to stand, too drained to resist. Daniel caught him, one arm wrapping around his shaking frame. "You're okay," he whispered, feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath the damp fur. "I've got you." For the first time in hours, maybe even days, the dog closed his eyes. He was no longer alone. A life once lived. As Daniel lifted the frail body into his arms, his mind churned with questions. How long had the dog been here? Had he once been a beloved pet? The thought of someone tying him up and leaving him to die made Daniel's stomach turn. There was a cruelty in abandonment, an act worse than outright harm. It was the decision to erase a life, to render love meaningless. He carried the shepherd to his truck, careful not to jostle him too much. The dog barely stirred, his head resting against Daniel's shoulder, his breath warm and shallow. Once inside, Daniel cranked up the heat, letting the warm air flow toward the shivering dog. For a moment, they just sat there, rain pounding against the windshield, creating a rhythm that matched the heavy thud of Daniel's heartbeat. He watched as the dog tried to lift his head but failed. His eyelids fluttered, exhausted beyond measure. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Daniel muttered, running a hand over the damp fur. He could feel the bones beneath the surface, starvation, neglect. And yet, despite everything, there was still trust in those amber eyes. Daniel let out a slow breath. He knew what needed to be done. He reached for his phone, dialing the only person he knew would understand. "Rebecca?" His sister's voice answered on the second ring, groggy from sleep. "Hey," Daniel exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I need a favor." Rebecca Carter had always been the one to talk sense into him, the voice of reason when he took in one too many strays, when he let his heart rule over logic. But she never truly stopped him. She knew Daniel couldn't turn away from a life in need. "You found another one, didn't you?" She sighed. "Not just another one." He glanced at the dog, watching as his ears twitched at the sound of Daniel's voice. A shepherd. Someone tied him to a tree and left him there. A pause. Then, "Jesus, Danny. What is wrong with people?" "I don't know," he admitted, rubbing his temple. "But he needs help." Rebecca didn't hesitate. "Bring him over. I'll get the supplies ready." As Daniel hung up, he reached out, running a gentle hand down the shepherd's side. "Looks like you're coming home with me, buddy," he murmured. "Hope you don't mind a warm bed and a full belly." The dog didn't respond, but his breathing slowed, his body no longer shaking quite as violently. Maybe, just maybe, he knew he was safe now. The drive home was slow, the rain turning the streets into glistening rivers of light, each raindrop smearing the windshield like an unfinished painting. Daniel kept glancing over at the German shepherd curled up in the passenger seat, wrapped in an old blanket he kept in the truck. The dog barely moved, his breath slow, his body rising and falling in an exhausted rhythm. Daniel had seen mistreated animals before, cases of neglect, of starvation, of abandonment, but something about this one gnawed at him deeper than usual. Maybe it was the way the dog had been waiting, tethered to that tree, refusing to believe that the person he had once trusted had left him to die. Loyalty, even in the face of cruelty. "You deserve better," Daniel muttered under his breath, gripping the wheel a little tighter. The city lights faded as he drove into the countryside, where his small home sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and towering oaks. It was a modest place, nothing fancy. Just enough space for himself, his practice, and the occasional stray that found its way into his care. By the time he pulled into the gravel driveway, the storm had settled into a quiet drizzle, mist rising from the ground like breath on a cold morning. The shepherd stirred as Daniel opened the truck door, his ears flicking, but he was too weak to move on his own. "It's okay, buddy," Daniel said softly, lifting him into his arms. "Almost there." The shepherd didn't resist. He didn't fight. That worried Daniel more than anything. Inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of cedarwood from the fireplace. Rebecca was already there, kneeling on the kitchen floor, a first aid kit and clean towels spread out beside her. "God," she breathed, eyes widening as Daniel set the shepherd down gently. "He's worse than I thought." Daniel knelt beside her, running careful hands over the dog's body, checking for injuries beneath the tangled fur. His ribs jutted out, his paws raw from scraping against the pavement. Old scars marred his skin, faint reminders of a past Daniel didn't want to imagine. Someone dumped him, Daniel said, voice tight, tied him to a tree and left him there. Rebecca exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Some people don't deserve dogs. She worked quickly, her hands steady as she cleaned the shepherd's wounds, dabbing antiseptic onto the cuts along his legs. The dog flinched, his eyes flicking between them, but he didn't bite. He just watched, as if waiting to see if they would hurt him too. Daniel stroked his head, murmuring reassurances. "You're safe now." Minutes stretched into an hour as they worked in silence, patching him up, hydrating him with small doses of water. When Rebecca finally leaned back, wiping her hands on a towel, she let out a soft sigh. "He's strong," she said. "But he's been through hell." Daniel nodded, running a hand through his damp hair. "We'll get him through it." They moved him to a soft dog bed near the fireplace, where the warmth could seep into his cold bones. The shepherd curled up instinctively, his body relaxing into the cushion, a deep sigh escaping him. Rebecca watched him for a moment, then turned to Daniel. "What are you going to do?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Keep him." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Yeah, I figured." She stood, stretching her arms. "I should get going. Call me if anything changes." Daniel walked her to the door, thanking her before stepping back inside. He lingered in the quiet warmth of his home, his gaze drifting to the dog sleeping soundly by the fire. He still didn't know the shepherd's name. He had no idea where he had come from, what he had endured. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to be alone ever again. The first signs of trouble. The following morning, Daniel awoke to the soft sound of paws on hardwood. He blinked against the early light filtering through the curtains, his body heavy with sleep. Then he heard it, a low whine, a hesitant shuffle. He turned his head and saw the shepherd standing in the doorway of his bedroom, staring at him with uncertain eyes. His legs wobbled slightly, his body still weak, but he had made it this far on his own. Daniel pushed himself upright, offering a small smile. "Morning, buddy." The dog's tail twitched, not a full wag, just a ghost of movement, but it was enough to make Daniel's chest tighten. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle him. "You hungry?" The shepherd's ears perked slightly at the word. Daniel took that as a yes. In the kitchen, he prepared a simple meal, boiled chicken, rice, and a bit of broth. Something easy on his stomach. The shepherd ate cautiously at first, taking slow, deliberate bites, but soon the hunger overtook him, and he finished every last morsel. "Good boy," Daniel murmured. The dog licked his lips, then looked up at Daniel with something new in his gaze. A spark. Daniel let out a slow breath. It was going to take time. But they were getting somewhere. But then came the knock on the door. It was sharp, urgent. Daniel frowned, setting down his coffee before crossing the room. When he pulled the door open, he was met with the sight of a man in his late 40s, his eyes dark with something unreadable. His gaze flickered past Daniel, landing on the shepherd curled near the fireplace. "There he is," the man said. "That's my dog." Daniel's breath stilled. His body went cold. The shepherd had stiffened, his ears flattening, his body lowering slightly in an almost involuntary reaction. Not excitement, not relief, fear. Daniel's jaw clenched. He took a slow step forward, positioning himself between the stranger and the dog. "I found him tied to a tree," he said evenly. "No food, no water. If he was yours, you weren't taking care of him." The man's mouth pressed into a thin line. "That's none of your business. He belongs to me." Daniel felt his pulse hammering. He didn't know this man, didn't trust him. But more than that, the shepherd's reaction told him everything he needed to know. "You abandoned him," Daniel said, voice low. The man let out a bitter chuckle. "And? He's just a dog. What do you care?" Daniel saw red. He took another step forward, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "Leave!" The man's expression darkened. "I could call the police, report a stolen animal." Daniel didn't blink. "Go ahead. Tell them how you left him to die." Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. The man's jaw worked, his hands flexing at his sides, but there was something in Daniel's eyes that made him hesitate. Finally, he scoffed. "Fine. Keep the damn mutt. Not like he was worth much anyway." Daniel didn't move until the man turned, stomping down the steps and disappearing into the morning light. Only then did he exhale, his entire body shaking with rage. Behind him, the shepherd let out a small, broken whimper. Daniel turned, kneeling beside him, running gentle fingers through his fur. "He's not coming back," he whispered. "You're safe now." And for the first time, the dog leaned into him. A choice had been made, and neither of them would ever look back. The man was gone, but his presence still lingered like a foul stench, poisoning the morning air. Daniel sat in silence, his hand resting gently on the shepherd's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath. The dog had pressed himself against Daniel's side, his body trembling, not from the cold, not from hunger, but from something deeper. Fear. Daniel clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had seen dogs react this way before. Trauma left invisible scars, ones that ran deeper than any physical wound. This shepherd wasn't just abandoned, he had been broken, and that man, his so-called owner, had been the one to do it. Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself. The important thing now was to rebuild what had been shattered. "You're safe," he murmured, fingers trailing along the shepherd's fur, feeling the ridges of his ribs beneath his palm. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." The dog didn't respond, but his shaking slowed. Just a little. That was enough for now. First steps toward healing. The day passed in quiet movements. Daniel let the shepherd dictate the pace, never forcing him into anything. He set out a soft bed near the fireplace, but the dog refused to lie down unless Daniel was close by. He placed food in the bowl, but the shepherd would only eat when Daniel was sitting nearby, as if afraid the meal would be stolen the moment he looked away. Trust had been shattered. Rebuilding it would take time, but Daniel had time. Over the next few days, small victories began to appear. The shepherd started following Daniel from room to room, keeping a careful distance but never straying too far. His steps were hesitant at first, his ears constantly flicking, listening for danger. But the more Daniel spoke, his voice always calm, always reassuring, the more the shepherd began to respond. A week later, Daniel caught him wagging his tail. Just once, just for a second. But it was a start. Nightmares and memories. But healing was never linear. Some nights Daniel woke to the sound of whimpering, low, broken sounds that made his heart ache. He would find the shepherd curled tightly into himself, paws twitching, his breath coming in sharp, uneven pants. Nightmares. Daniel didn't wake him. He had seen enough trauma in both animals and humans to know that waking someone in the midst of fear could do more harm than good. Instead, he sat beside him, close enough for the shepherd to feel his presence. In time, the dog would settle, his breath evening out, his body no longer locked in terror. And when he finally opened his amber eyes, looking up at Daniel in confusion, Daniel would whisper, "It's okay, buddy. You're not there anymore." The shepherd would blink, his ears twitching, and then, with slow hesitation, he would rest his head against Daniel's leg. It was the closest thing to trust Daniel had ever seen. A name to call his own. Naming a dog was something Daniel never rushed. He always waited for the right moment, for the right name to present itself. And then, one evening, it did. Daniel was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. The shepherd sat beside him, his body relaxed for the first time since he had arrived. It was a quiet moment, a peaceful one. Then, out of nowhere, a gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves, sending a few stray ones spiraling toward the ground. The shepherd's ears perked up. He lifted his head slightly, watching the leaves dance in the air. And then, for the first time, he lifted his paw and swiped at one. Daniel's breath caught. It was such a simple thing, a small moment of curiosity, of playfulness, something that had been buried beneath weeks, maybe years, of suffering. A smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's lips. "Storm," he murmured. The shepherd turned his head slightly, amber eyes locking onto Daniel's. The name felt right. "Storm," Daniel repeated, reaching out to run a hand along the shepherd's back. "What do you think, buddy?" The dog didn't flinch, didn't shrink away. And then, slowly, hesitantly, his tail wagged. Daniel chuckled softly, rubbing between his ears. Yeah, storm it is. A bond strengthened by firestorm was healing, but the past had its claws deep in him. It showed in the way he flinched at sudden movements, in the way he still hesitated before taking food, as if expecting it to be yanked away. And worst of all, in the way he tensed whenever Daniel picked up anything resembling a leash. One morning, Daniel tried. He reached for a leash, moving slowly, giving Storm time to see that he wasn't a threat. But the moment the metal clasp jingled, Storm froze. His body went stiff, his tail tucked between his legs. Then, before Daniel could even react, Storm bolted. He crashed into the table, knocking over a chair, scrambling against the hardwood floor in his desperation to escape. His eyes were wild, pupils blown wide with panic. Daniel immediately dropped the leash. "Storm," he said, keeping his voice gentle, low. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." Storm had pressed himself against the far wall, his body shaking violently. His breath came in sharp gasps, his chest rising and falling too fast. Daniel moved carefully, sitting down on the floor, making himself as unthreatening as possible. "I promise," he murmured. "You're safe." It took long minutes, but eventually, Storm's breathing slowed. The tension in his shoulders loosened, just a little. Daniel didn't try again that day. He knew trust couldn't be forced. Instead, he left the leash on the floor, in plain sight, letting Storm investigate it on his own terms. Days passed before Storm dared to approach it. Weeks before, he allowed Daniel to clip it onto his collar without panicking. But when the day finally came, when Daniel took him outside for their first real walk together, Storm didn't try to run. He stayed close, right by Daniel's side. The past comes knocking again. It had been a month since the man had come to Daniel's doorstep, demanding Storm back. A month since Daniel had stared him down and refused. And for a while, things had been peaceful. Until one night, when Daniel stepped outside and found a note pinned to his front door. "I want my dog back." Daniel's blood turned cold. Storm, who had followed him onto the porch, let out a low, uneasy whine. His body was tense, ears flicking, eyes scanning the darkness. Daniel looked out into the night, his stomach twisting. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but he knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. The note burned in Daniel's hand, its message simple but heavy with threat. "I want my dog back." He scanned the darkened tree line beyond his porch, his breath slow and controlled, but his body thrummed with tension. He wasn't sure if the man was still out there, hidden among the shadows, watching. Storm stood beside him, his body rigid, ears pricked, a low growl vibrating in his throat. He knew. He could sense the shift in the air, the return of something dark from his past. Daniel took a slow breath, then tore the note in half, letting the pieces flutter to the wooden porch. He wasn't going to be intimidated. Not by a man who had abandoned this dog like garbage. Still, the unease remained, curling in his stomach like a storm cloud waiting to break. He crouched beside Storm, running a hand through the German shepherd's thick fur. "You're safe," he murmured. "I won't let him take you. Storm leaned into him, just a little, but his eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. Daniel knew this wasn't over. An unwanted visit. The next day, Daniel took no chances. He reinforced the locks on his doors, checked the security cameras he had installed months ago, but never truly needed, until now. He let Rebecca know what was happening, and she offered to come stay with him, but Daniel refused. This was his fight, his responsibility. But despite his precautions, the unease didn't leave him. And then, 2 nights later, it happened. It was past midnight when Storm's growl woke him. Daniel sat up instantly, heart pounding, instincts on high alert. Storm was standing by the bedroom door, his body stiff, his fur bristling. His growl was low, dangerous. Then Daniel heard it. A noise outside. Slow footsteps on gravel. Someone was on his property. Adrenaline surged through him. He moved swiftly, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by his nightstand before creeping toward the front door. Through the peephole, he saw a shadowed figure standing just beyond the porch light's reach. Then, a knock. Sharp. Deliberate. Daniel inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. He opened the door. The man from before stood there, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held something dangerous. "You've had your fun playing hero," the man said, voice low and cold. "Now give me my dog." Storm was behind Daniel, his lips pulled back in a silent snarl, his entire body trembling with barely contained fury. Daniel held the doorframe, his stance unmoving. "He's not yours anymore." The man let out a dark chuckle, shaking his head. "You really think you can keep him? He's mine. Always has been." Daniel's patience snapped. "You don't get to say that. You tied him to a tree and left him to die. That's not ownership. That's cruelty." The man's jaw tightened. "That's none of your damn business." Daniel stepped forward, his grip tightening on the bat. "It became my business the moment I found him." For a moment, the 2 men stared each other down, the air between them thick with unspoken threats. Then the man's lips curled into a sneer. "This isn't over." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the night. Storm didn't stop growling until long after the sound of the man's footsteps faded. The breaking point. Daniel barely slept that night. He sat awake in the dim glow of the fireplace. Storm curled beside him, both of them tense, waiting. By morning, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't keep waiting for this man to make his next move. He had to act first. With Storm by his side, he drove into town, heading straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Mark Holloway was an old friend, a man Daniel had grown up with. He listened in silence as Daniel recounted everything, the abandonment, the threats, the late-night visit. When Daniel was done, Holloway sighed, rubbing his jaw. "I wish I could do more," he admitted. "But technically, if he was the original owner, there's a legal gray area here." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "So what? You're telling me he can just take him back?" "I'm telling you we need more," Holloway said. "If we can prove abuse, that's different. But right now, it's your word against his." Frustration burned in Daniel's chest. He wasn't about to let some loophole decide Storm's fate. Holloway must have seen the fire in Daniel's eyes because he leaned forward. "Listen, I'll put patrols around your property for the next few nights. And if he so much as steps foot on your land again, we'll have him for trespassing." It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was something. Daniel left the office feeling no safer than before, because deep down, he knew this man wasn't the type to give up so easily. The final confrontation. The night was heavy with tension. Daniel kept a gun locked in his drawer, something he had never thought he'd need, but tonight, he felt its weight more than ever. Storm was restless, pacing near the door, his ears flicking at every sound. He knew. Then, a noise outside. Not footsteps, not the rustling of wind. A car engine. Daniel's stomach dropped. He moved to the window, barely pulling back the curtain. A truck was parked at the edge of his driveway. The man had come back. Daniel grabbed the bat again, adrenaline surging through him. Storm was already at the door, his body rigid. And then, suddenly, bang! The sound of wood splintering. Daniel's body reacted before his mind could catch up. The front door was being forced open. Storm lunged first. A deep, bone-chilling snarl tore from his throat as he launched himself forward, his powerful frame a blur of fury. Daniel saw the man stumble back, shock flashing across his face. He had underestimated Storm. Storm's teeth sank into the man's arm. A scream ripped through the night. Daniel moved fast, grabbing the man by the collar and shoving him back, his voice a growl. "Get the hell off my property!" The man's face was twisted in rage and pain, his arm bleeding from where Storm had bitten him. "You!" he spat, his breath ragged. Daniel didn't let him finish. "If I ever see you near him again, I swear to God, I will make sure you never hurt another animal in your life." The man's eyes flicked to Storm, still growling, his body coiled to attack again if needed. And then, he turned and ran. Daniel stood there, breath heaving, heart hammering in his chest. Storm stayed by his side, his amber eyes locked on the retreating figure. This time, Daniel knew. It was over. A new beginning. It took a while for the adrenaline to fade, but when it did, Daniel sank to the floor beside Storm, burying his fingers in his thick fur. "You did good," he murmured. "Real good." Storm let out a soft huff, pressing his forehead against Daniel's chest. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel knew. Storm wasn't afraid anymore. He had fought back. He had reclaimed his life. He was finally home. The night had settled into an eerie stillness, as if the world itself had exhaled after the storm of violence and fear. The man was gone, his truck's taillights swallowed by the darkness, and with him went the weight of an unspoken war. But in the aftermath, Daniel felt no triumph, only exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that coiled around him like a heavy chain. Storm stood beside him, his chest rising and falling rapidly, the adrenaline still coursing through his body. His fur was bristled, his stance tense, but his eyes, those amber eyes that once held nothing but fear, were now steady, focused. He had faced his past, and he had won. Daniel let out a slow breath, running a hand down Storm's back, grounding both of them. "It's over, buddy," he murmured. "He's not coming back." Storm let out a low huff, a sound somewhere between relief and exhaustion. But Daniel wasn't taking any chances. Without another word, he turned, guiding Storm back inside the house, locking the door behind them. The shattered wood where the man had kicked it in was a brutal reminder of how close things had come to disaster. He would fix it tomorrow. Tonight, they just needed to breathe. Storm hesitated near the doorway, his ears twitching, his eyes still flicking toward the window as if expecting the man to reappear. Daniel crouched beside him, his voice low and steady. "Hey," he said softly. "Look at me." Storm did. "You're safe now," Daniel whispered, pressing his forehead gently against Storm's. "I promise you, no one is ever going to hurt you again." For the first time, Storm closed his eyes and leaned into him. Not out of fear, not out of exhaustion, but out of trust. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, something raw and painful and deeply, deeply human. He had saved this dog, but in ways he hadn't expected, Storm had saved him too. The first morning of freedom dawn broke softly, golden light spilling through the windows, cutting through the remnants of the storm. For the first time in weeks, Daniel woke up without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on his chest. Storm was curled up beside his bed, his breathing slow and even. He was still asleep, his body relaxed in a way Daniel hadn't seen before. No twitching paws, no frantic whimpering dreams. just peace. Daniel let him rest as he moved through the quiet house, the events of the night before playing over and over in his head. It could have ended so much worse, but it hadn't, because Storm had refused to be a victim, and Daniel had refused to let him go. An hour later, Storm finally stirred, stretching out his long legs before blinking up at Daniel with a quiet curiosity. Daniel smiled. "Good morning." Storm's tail thumped against the floor once, a small, hesitant wag. Daniel's smile widened. "That's right, buddy. No more running, no more fear." Storm stood, shaking out his thick fur, before padding toward the front door. His body language was different now, more sure, more confident. He wasn't just existing anymore. He was living. Daniel grabbed his jacket and followed him outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. The world felt different, lighter. Storm trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, taking in the sense of the new day. Daniel watched as he moved, not skittish, not hesitant, but with purpose. For the first time, Storm wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was finally free. A bond that couldn't be broken. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the changes in Storm became undeniable. The nightmares came less frequently. The hesitation in his movements faded. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds, no longer tensed when Daniel reached for his collar. And then came the moment Daniel hadn't even realized he was waiting for. It was late one evening, the house quiet except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. Storm lay beside Daniel on the couch, his body warm and heavy against his side. And then, without hesitation, without fear, Storm lifted his head and licked Daniel's hand. It was small, barely a second, but Daniel knew what it meant. Storm had chosen him. Not because he had no other option, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to. Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat, his fingers threading through Storm's fur. "I love you too, buddy," he whispered. Storm let out a content sigh and rested his head on Daniel's lap. For the first time in a long, long time, neither of them was alone. A name that would last forever. One morning, Daniel was sitting on the porch, watching Storm bask in the warm sunlight. The past few weeks had transformed him into a different dog, stronger, happier. And then it hit him. Storm wasn't just any dog. Storm was his dog. He needed to make it official. So, later that afternoon, Daniel drove into town, Storm sitting beside him in the passenger seat like he had always belonged there. They pulled up to the courthouse, the building standing tall under the blue sky. Daniel hesitated for a moment, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. This was it, the final step. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the truck, Storm following him with quiet confidence. Inside, the air smelled like old books and ink-stained paperwork. The woman behind the counter looked up as they approached, offering a warm smile. "I'd like to file for legal ownership," Daniel said, resting a hand on Storm's back. The clerk smiled warmly as she pulled out the necessary paperwork. "Looks like you two have been through a lot together." Daniel glanced down at Storm, who sat calmly by his feet, his amber eyes bright, his tail wagging gently. "Yeah," Daniel murmured. "We have." With each signature, with each pen stroke, Daniel felt something settle inside him. Storm wasn't just a rescue. He was family. And nothing, not fear, not threats, not the ghosts of the past, would ever change that. A future built on trust. The drive home was quiet, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun began its slow descent. Storm sat in the back seat, his head resting on the armrest, his amber eyes watching the world outside with quiet curiosity. As Daniel turned onto the long dirt road leading home, he felt something shift deep inside him. For so long, he had been moving through life without direction, without a real purpose beyond his work. But now, he had something worth protecting, someone worth fighting for. Storm let out a content sigh, curling up as the truck rumbled down the familiar road. Daniel reached out, running a hand over his thick fur. "Let's go home, buddy." And for the first time, Storm knew exactly what that word meant. Home. Not a place, but a person. And that person was Daniel. The house was quiet now, filled only with the steady crackle of the fireplace and the soft sound of Storm's breathing. He lay curled at Daniel's feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded in contentment. It had been a long road, one filled with fear, uncertainty, and shadows of the past. But they had made it through. Together. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire, his thoughts drifting. He had never expected any of this. Never expected to find a dog abandoned and broken. Never expected to fight so hard for something he hadn't even known he needed. But now? Now he couldn't imagine life without Storm. His gaze drifted down to the German shepherd, whose ears flicked slightly, as if sensing Daniel's thoughts. A faint smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "You're a damn good dog," he murmured. Storm's tail thumped against the wooden floor once, a silent acknowledgement. Daniel exhaled slowly, staring into the flames. There was something he had learned from all of this, something deeper than just rescuing a dog. It was about second chances. Storm had been left behind, discarded like he was nothing. But he wasn't nothing. He was loyal, strong, brave. He had just needed someone to see it, to fight for him when he couldn't fight for himself. And wasn't that true for so many?